Respected elders and brothers, first and foremost, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yes, we repeat this every week and we should repeat it daily. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us Iman, the blessing of Iman. So many millions of people in the world are deprived of the blessing of Iman. And if a person passes away in that state without Iman, then there's no hope for that person in the Akhirah. This world is but a few days. When we close our eyes and we return to Almighty Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then that will be the only accepted formula for success. There will be no other formula for success. So we should go to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the blessing of Iman, and we need to, at the same token, make effort on our Iman and preserve our Iman. Make effort to preserving the Iman of ourselves and of our children and those around us. Allah ta'ala guide us all and grant us all perfect Iman. For the last 2 weeks we've been discussing some of the laws of inheritance, Islamic laws of succession. In the first week we emphasized the understanding that everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we close our eyes, whatever we've been in possession of returns firstly to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we are not the owners of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Malik Yawmiddin. Allah ta'ala is the owner of everything. So we are not the owners of it, and we cannot do with it as we please. To have the attitude that we can do with it as we please is contrary to Iman and not acceptable. So it is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who is the owner of it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will command us during our life how we should use it, how we should not use it, how we may dispose of it, how we may not dispose of it. And when it comes to inheritance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's name is Al-Warith. It goes back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah ta'ala didn't dispose of it as He pleases in the ayat of Surah Nisa. Last week we discussed some of the inheritance portions which Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned in the Quran Kareem, which generally cover about 90% of the inheritance cases that we come across. Obviously there are more specified and more complex cases, and there's a different platform for that. This week, inshallah, I'd like to go through a will from an Islamic point of view. So yes, the hadith I've just mentioned before you of Ibn Umar radiallahu anhu, he says that Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam said, مَا حَقِّ امْرِئٍ مُسْلِمٍ لَهُ شَيْءٌ يُوصِي فِيهِ يَبِيتُ لَيْلَتَيْنِ إِلَّا وَصِيَّتُهُ مَكْتُوبَةً عِنْدَهُ. This was mentioned last week and it's mentioned again today. It is not permissible for a Muslim to pass 2 nights without a will. According to another interpretation of this hadith, a person who passes away without leaving a will is not entitled to an Islamic burial. So obviously the ruling is quite obvious, especially for us in a country with secular law, un-Islamic law, that it is compulsory for each and every mukallaf Muslim to have a will. Obviously, a will is a legal document. And because it's a legal document, there are also legal requirements which need to be complied with. So very important for us as Muslims. First and foremost, we need to comply with the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The world belongs to Allah ta'ala. Allah ta'ala is Malik Yawmiddin. We return to Akhirat. Everything belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we need to comply with the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And when we're dealing with the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on one hand, and man-made secular law on the other hand, you are always going to have contradictions. We need to then make a choice and understand. Are we going to choose the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or are we going to choose secular man-made law? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Alimul Hakim, He's all-knowing, most wise, and His law never changes. Whereas secular law constantly changes, and there's a constant evolution in it. This itself is evidence enough to understand that the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is perfect, and secular law, man-made law, can never be perfect. So each and every one of us are given a choice. Are we going to practice on the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or are we going to give preference to secular law over the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Also, at the same time, while our objective being the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, we may also use secular law as a means of implementing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So where it is possible, and to the extent possible, to the extent necessary, we are able to use secular law, but for the object of implementing our Sharia, for the object of implementing the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and never to circumvent the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. More specifically, when it comes to inheritance, we obviously have a set of secular laws, a set of man-made laws, and then we have the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In South Africa, we have primarily two pieces of legislation which affects our world. Primarily your Wills Act and an Interstate Succession Act. One of the most important clauses that we have in the Wills Act is what we call freedom of testation. A person is free to make a will as he likes, as he wishes. In Islam, there's no such thing. In the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as freedom of testation in the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are not entitled to spend our belongings and to dispose of our belongings as we wish. It does not belong to us, it belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We are merely custodians. Yes, obviously there's a further rule regarding wasiyyah which we'll come to very shortly. And where we are granted a concession of 1/3 of our estate where we may be able to make certain wasiyyah. But as a general rule, we may not dispose of our assets as we deem fit, or as we wish. And with the understanding that it belongs to me, I can do with it as I please. So this is a very major contradiction that we have. On the one hand, we have your secular law stating freedom of testation. On the other hand, we have the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, you cannot spend your wealth as you wish. It belongs to me. I am the owner. I will determine how this wealth must be disposed of, and how it must be dissolved. How the estate is to be dissolved. However, this does not stop us from using the man-made law as a means of attaining within all the ambits of Sharia and without compromising any concept or any law of Sharia to fulfill the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whereas on the one hand we have freedom of gestation as a general rule, and that's why we find that many people, specifically non-Muslims, leave large inheritances for their dogs and pets and so on, because they are free to do so in man-made law. On the other hand, how do we use this to implement the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? We have a specific, very general and very important, all-encompassing clause in our words to state that my wish and my desire is that my estate must be devolved according to the laws of Islam, according to the laws of Islamic succession. So this then becomes a very important clause in our words. So you mentioned last week, it is never possible to determine who your heirs are while you are living. This is something that can only be determined once a person passes away. Because it is only at that point that you will understand who has survived you. Nobody knows beforehand who will survive you. So it is only at this point where a person's heirs can be determined. So this then becomes a very important clause, because then what happens in practice is obviously this will is submitted to the Master of the High Court, and together with it, an issue is generally issued, a certificate is issued by an Islamic institution, which then sets out who the heirs are to a certain deceased person and what their portions are. So this becomes your most important clause in your will, basically to state that I do not want my inheritance to go according to secular law, I want my inheritance to go according to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is how we may use this clause in our favor and as a means of obtaining the will of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So whereas the Wills Act itself sets out the formal requirements for a valid will, there are various requirements that are in place for a will to be regarded as a valid will. For instance, the Wills Act will tell us who can make a will, how old you need to be to make a will. So a person 16 years old and above is entitled to make a will. So anybody here, age of 16 and above, you should know automatically you should be having a legally valid will. And it sets out the various other requirements of a valid will. Who can be a witness? Who cannot be a witness? What type of document are you signing? Can you print on two sides of the document? What type of ink should you use? You should use black ink, should use color ink, and so on. So these are all set out in the Wills Act. Non-compliance with the Wills Act will result in the will being not accepted, or possibly in a contest of the will. So for instance, if there's a dispute, a person can contest the will and say, look, this will has not been executed properly. There are certain shortcomings in the will. And as a result, the will will be disregarded. So it's very common that we see in practice. I'd probably say about 80% of wills, generic wills that we see, have major shortfalls, major shortcomings. And as a result, the will is not usable in the wills. So a person thinks and understands that, look, he's done his will, he's filled in some sort of generic will that he found on the internet or wherever else, and in his mind he's fulfilled his duty. But because he's not complied with the Wills Act, this will is of no force. And unfortunately, this is the case in majority of the wills. It's a very small portion of the wills where the Wills Act is complied with. And it's very easy to understand this. Unfortunately, many of us, myself, are guilty of this in many other instances. For instance, where we see terms and conditions. Very rarely do we read the terms and conditions, we just go to accept. And it's the same thing we do with regard to our wills. So yes, there may be a generic will in an institution, there will be instructions on how to complete a will. But very rarely will the people read the instructions of the will and carry out the instructions of the will. Even more so, people won't even read the will itself. And that's the reality. People have no idea what goes on in the will, just merely thinking that if I have a generic will, it's good enough. So it's very important for us to understand that yes, our will must first be importantly be in accordance of the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And secondly, it must also comply with the Wills Act to have for it to be given any effect. Because if it does not comply with the Wills Act, and the will is disregarded, again we end up back at square one. It's as if we did not have a will, and ultimately the inheritance may then be distributed according to the South African law of succession. And we obviously know that this is contrary to the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is predominantly from Roman Dutch law. Besides the Wills Act and the Interstate Succession Act, by default, there are many other laws which apply to us. If we remain silent on these laws then apply by default. So again, very important for us, we need to exclude these from operation in our will. Obviously, time does not permit, and neither is it the platform for such. But very briefly, just to mention some of the things which apply by default. And if you do not take care of it in our wills, then the general law will apply to it and we may have issues later on. One is security of the Master of the High Court. So by default, the Master will require security from your executors to carry out your will. A person may not be in a position to provide security. A person may be in a position but may not be willing to bond his property security to the Master of the High Court and so on. So for this we have a provision in the will stating that my executors will not be required to provide security to the Master of the High Court. Secondly, when it comes to minors, by default again, the Master of the High Court is the upper guardian of all minors, and any inheritance agreed to minors by default is supposed to go into the guardian's fund. Now, as we know, the guardian's fund is an interest fund. It's totally haram, totally unacceptable. So if you do not make provision for it, then again by default, any inheritance of a minor will then go into the guardian's fund. Again, totally impermissible. So here again we step in, and obviously it's a very technical clause, there's a lot of technicalities involved, but we have a clause for it, stating that any inheritance due to a minor shall be in the hands of the executors, obviously to administer on their behalf. Furthermore, marriages. We may have heirs which happen to be married in community of property. So what happens to their inheritance by default? For instance, you may be married according to an antenuptial contract, which is acceptable. But your children, for whatever reason, may happen to be married in community of property, which is not acceptable. So when you pass away by default, what will then happen is the inheritance of your child is then shared by their spouse. Again, this is not permitted in Sharia. And on the same note, we should all understand at this moment, yes, there are various laws that are changing at the moment. Marriage bill has been in evolution. And with regard to Islamic marriages specifically, so yes, Islamic marriages may now be recognized, but the law at no point explains what are the property rights of the husband and the wife during this Islamic marriage. So the current situation is that it's open to the courts to interpret whether the marriage should be deemed to be in community of property, or whether we should have the dual system, or whether dual also should be excluded. So from this point of view, it's very important for every married person to make sure you have an antenuptial contract in place. Why should we have our antenuptial contract in place? Because this is the only matrimonial property regime which is in accordance with the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other two matrimonial property regimes infringe on the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So that is the primary reason. Obviously for business and tax reasons and so on, it's advisable from those point of views as well. And there are certain other laws which apply to our worlds as well, for example, coercion and other laws. So these are all clauses that we need to provide for in our will. If we do not provide these clauses in our will, the probability is the law will apply by default, and we may end up with issues later on. So then we come back to the point of what we actually put in the will. Yes, we mentioned the most important clause that my inheritance must be disposed of in accordance of the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, according to the laws of succession, and a certificate will be issued for that. What other input do we have in our will? We mentioned that we can't decide on our inheritance who our heirs are, who are not our heirs. Obviously, that's out of the question. So our input comes in from two aspects. Number one is what we call the head of the will, and number two is what we call the heart of the will. So the head of the will is the mind, your thinking, the brain set, and these are your executors. So obviously for each and every will you need an executor. The executor is a very important person. Who would be an ideal executor? An ideal executor would be a person who you trust enough will step into your shoes and dispose of your inheritance in terms of the will and in terms of the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as quick as possible, as soon as possible. So this is an ideal executor. So there's a few qualities that's required here. Firstly, he needs to be an honest person. You need to be an honest person. You cannot have a dishonest person being an executor. Secondly, they need to have and understand the value that the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more important than any other law, and fulfill it accordingly. Thirdly, they need to be people who will get the job done, people who will get the work done. So you may have a good person, you may have a wonderful person, you may be an honest person, or whatever it may be. But if the person is unable to get the work done, then he's useless as an executor. We see many, many cases where the inheritance is going on for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and even longer. The reason being is either the executors don't have the capacity to do the work, or they don't have the willpower to do the work, or they feel intimidated by the work. So this again makes a will useless. So when it comes to your executor, you need to think very carefully who you wish to have as an executor. Furthermore, they need to be level-headed people. Ideally, we prefer 3 executors in the event that one of the executors pass away before us. Or in the event of a dispute between the executors, we have some sort of a majority. So ideally, we prefer 3 executors. And these 3 executors should also obviously be people who are able to communicate with one another. We can't have, people may be good people in their own rights, but they may not be able to work together. This again becomes a stumbling block. So that's as far as our executors are concerned. A general misconception regarding executors is people have the misconception that you cannot have a family, your children, your spouse as an executor. This is a misconception, this is incorrect. Ideally, we prefer somebody from the family to be one of the executors. The second portion of our will where we have an input is the heart of the will, and it is your wasiyah. So very importantly, before we get to the wasiyah, and this is a general rule for the will as a whole, I had mentioned a hadith before you and I will repeat it. In a hadith of Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, he said, قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم إن الرجل لا يعمل والمرأة بطاعة الله 60 سنة. A man or a woman may live the entire life, 60 years refers to an entire life Islamically. So the person may live his entire life according to the laws of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and in the obedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. ثم يحضرهم الموت, and at the time of death comes. فيضاران في الوصية. And now you make a will that is incorrect. You make a will that transgresses the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You make a wasiyah that transgresses the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The actual words for this, from this hadith is وَجَبَتْ لَهُمُ النَّارِ, Jahannam is wajib for that person. So you should think what a severe rule it is, what a severe commandment it is from the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. That Jahannam is wajib, Jahannam is compulsory for that person, even though he lived in obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his entire life, but when it came to inheritance, he came to his will, he did something that is impermissible. Why? Because he now infringed on what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has determined directly. He infringed on Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's ownership. And for that reason, Jahannam is wajib for that person. So very common we see that people may have partially Islamic wills, and then part of it becomes un-Islamic, totally not permitted. And the most common way this takes place is where one spouse says to the other in their will that, look, in the event of me passing away, the house must go to my spouse, the business must go to my son, the jewelry must go to my daughter. This is totally impermissible in Islam. I mentioned to you another hadith. Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam says, فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ قَدْ أَعْطَى كُلَّ ذِي حَقٍّ حَقَّهُ فَلَا وَصِيَّةَ لِوَارِثِهِ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has already stipulated and has already given every heir what is their right. Accordingly, it is not permissible to make wasiyah to bequest anything to any heir. So anybody who happens to be your heir, it is not permissible to make any wasiyah for them. Whether it is your parents, whether it is your spouse, whether it is your children, their portions are already determined by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and can never be changed. So yes, if a person wishes to give anything to his spouse or to his children, this must be done in your lifetime. We have a habit of holding on. We want to keep things, we want to be in control. And then when we pass away, when it's no longer ours, then we want to determine where it can go or who should get it. This is not permissible. While we have it, while we're entitled to use it, we should use it. This is the moment. If you have to give it to your wife, you can give it to your wife. Or if you want to give it to your husband, give it to your husband. Do it in your lifetime and make sure possession takes place. Because when it comes to donations, if possession does not take place, the donation is not complete. With donations, possession is a requirement. Possession does not take place complete, undisturbed possession from an Islamic point of view. The donation is not complete. Very important to keep this in mind because we see this over and over again. Time is up, but very quickly I just mentioned two very other important laws with regard to wasiyah, what is permitted and what is not permitted. We mentioned one, that it is not permissible to make wasiyah for any heir. Secondly, the maximum wasiyah a person may make in his will is up to a maximum of 1/3 of his estate. And this also, remember, not for any of his heirs. Anybody else other than heirs. So generally what we then see in wasiyah is wasiyah for qada salah, outstanding fast and so on. And this is very important as well. Because according to the Hanafi school of thought, if a person does not make wasiyah for qada salah, qada fast and so on, it is not the right of the estate, or it's not an ability to the estate to pay these kafara out and so on. The second generally known wasiyah that we have is generally wasiyah in charity and so on. And here again very briefly, my humble advice is whatever charity you can do in your lifetime, do it in your lifetime. It should not be that now when you're passing away, you have to take wasiyah for, you have to take the belongings of your wife and children and give it away in charity. Yes, it is allowed up to 1/3 of your estate and you won't deny you of that right. But it is also the hadith of Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, إِنَّكَ إِن تَرَكَ وَرَثَتَكَ أَغْنِيَاءَ خَيْرٌ مِنْ أَن تَرَكَهُمْ عَالَةً يَتَكَفَّفُونَ النَّاسَ فِي أَيْدِيهِمْ. It is better for you to leave your heirs wealthy than to leave them on the streets begging from people. So many times a person may hear about Isali Sawab and so on, and you go home and you make wasiyah of 1/3 of your estate in charity. But your entire estate may be only one house. What happens then? They need to sell your house to pay your charity, and then what happens to the wife and children? What good have you really done? So there are many other forms of wasiyah, and it's a lot more detailed and so on. What is permitted and what is not permitted is wasiyah, and those you may discuss with your local alim or whoever may be good to do so. This my humble plea to each and every one of us: let us get our words in order. Let us get our affairs in order, let us get our inheritance in order, and let us at all times keep the law of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala over and above any other law.